history. It's something we often take for granted, isn't it?
Absolutely.
Like the bedrock beneath our feet, the shared foundation of who we are, where we came from, and, well, how we understand the world.
Yeah, exactly. The ground truth, sort of.
But what if that foundation isn't as solid as we think? What if it's not just being reinterpreted, but actively and deliberately fractured?
Uh-huh.
We've all encountered alt-facts floating around, in the news cycle, those deliberate distortions of current events.
Right. Those are pretty obvious sometimes.
But there's a deeper, more pervasive, and arguably more dangerous cousin to that phenomenon. Alt-histories. These aren't just minor disagreements about the past. They seem like systematic, intentional rewritings of it.
You've hit on the core of our deep dive today.
Yeah.
Really. We're venturing into the, well, unsettling and critical phenomenon of alt-histories and the far-right revisionism that fuels them.
Okay.
Our exploration draws from an incredibly rich and comprehensive collection of essays titled Far-Right Revisionism and the End of History, Alt-Histories.
Ah, right. I remember seeing that title.
Yeah, this volume is, it's really quite something. It brings together insights from a really diverse group of minds, historians, sociologists, neuroscientists even, lawyers, cultural critics, media scholars.
Or that's a broad range.
It is.
Yeah.
And it provides this multifaceted lens, a way to examine these complex issues, showing us not just what these alt-histories are, but how they're constructed and why they pose such a significant threat.
So our mission today is to unpack precisely how these movements construct their counter-narratives to, well, the accepted understandings of history, fact, and narrative. And crucially, what urgent questions this raises for all of you, our listeners. This deep dive is about gaining knowledge quickly but thoroughly, providing those genuine aha moments without that feeling of information overload that, let's be honest, so many of us experience daily.
Right. We get bombarded.
We want you to walk away not just informed, but armed with a deeper understanding of how narratives are shaped and sometimes, well, weaponized.
That's precisely it. In today's fast-paced world, where information, and often, let's face it, carefully crafted misinformation comes at us constantly, understanding the deliberate distortion of history isn't just, an academic exercise.
No, it feels much bigger than that.
It really is. It's essential for cultivating robust critical thinking skills, for effectively navigating the often conflicting narratives that swirl around us, and ultimately for truly remaining well-informed.
Yeah.
Without a clear understanding of these mechanisms, it's remarkably easy to get swept away by narratives designed not to enlighten, but to persuade, to polarize, and ultimately maybe even to control how we perceive reality. The stakes for our collective understanding of truth are just incredibly high.
Okay, let's unpack this foundational idea then. Many prominent scholars, like Francis Fukuyama, famously theorized about an end of history.
Right, after the Cold War.
Exactly. His idea, with the triumph of neoliberalism, suggested that humanity had reached a kind of ideological consensus, a final destination for political and economic systems. It implied a certain stability, a sort of post-ideological world.
A stable plateau, almost.
Yeah, but if history supposedly ended, if we reached this global consensus, how is the far right so effectively threatening democracy and its institutions now? It feels like we're in a completely different world than the one Fukuyama envisioned.
That's a truly fundamental question, and the source material directly addresses it. It argues that the very notion of an end of history has been profoundly challenged and systematically undermined by the far right's pervasive dissemination of what it explicitly calls alt-facts and alt-histories.
Okay, so that's the weapon, essentially.
That's how the source frames it, yes. This isn't about minor disagreements over interpretations or, the healthy give and take of academic debates. No, this is a direct, intentional, and often aggressive challenge to the very idea of a shared, verifiable truth. By deliberately creating and spreading these alternative historical narratives, they fundamentally erode the kind of consensus Fukuyama envisioned.
Which then opens the door.
Exactly. It allows radical ideologies to gain traction, to normalize, and to directly threaten the core norms and institutions of democracy. It's a battle over shared reality itself.
That distinction feels incredibly important. We often hear about historical revisionism, and for a long time I thought that was just historians looking at old facts in new ways, maybe with new evidence.
Which it often is, in the legitimate sense.
Right. But this deep dive is clearly about something fundamentally different, something, well, far more insidious. What's the key distinction between legitimate historical revisionism, which is a healthy part of scholarship, and these alt-histories that we're focusing on today?
That's a crucial clarification, and it's where the nuance really lies. Let's start with historical revisionism. At its core, this is a legitimate, indeed necessary part of historiography, the writing of history.
Okay.
It involves the modification, reinterpretation, or even outright rejection of existing historical arguments. This often happens because new evidence comes to light, or existing archives are re-examined through a different lens, or perhaps previously overlooked information is recovered.
So, standard practice for historians.
Absolutely. Professional historians engage in this process rigorously, with painstaking attention to sources, and always, crucially, in good faith. It's how our collective understanding of the past evolves and progresses. It's a constant self-correction towards greater accuracy. Think of it as refining a map, making it more precise with new data points.
Got it. Refining the map.
Now contrast this sharply with alt-histories. These are characterized by intentional distortion. They fundamentally reject established facts and genuine historical inquiry.
Okay, so intent is key here.
Intent is absolutely key. Instead, they operate on a different principle entirely. They weaponize, decontextualize fragments of the past, often cherry-picking events or quotes, and then using them primarily to legitimate a pre-existing ideology or belief.
So the belief comes first.
Exactly. The goal is not to understand how things came to be through good faith investigation and a commitment to evidence. Instead, it's to construct a narrative that explicitly serves a contemporary political, social, or racial agenda. It's an ideological project first and foremost, a form of political propaganda, not an academic pursuit.
Right.
If legitimate revisionism is about refining a map, all histories are about drawing a completely different map that shows where they want to go, regardless of the actual terrain.
That makes a lot of sense. It's like legitimate revisionism is about building a more accurate picture, piece by piece, while alt-histories are about painting a completely different picture, regardless of what the pieces actually show. The source identifies specific techniques, almost a playbook, for how these alt-histories are manufactured. What are some of these methods that the far right uses to manipulate historical narratives? Because understanding the tactics is key to spotting them, right?
You're absolutely right. Understanding the tactics is paramount. The source outlines 7 distinct methods, and what's really insightful is that they often don't stand alone.
They work together.
Exactly. They're typically bundled together like a sophisticated toolkit, creating a powerful, albeit false and seemingly coherent narrative. The real aha moment here is understanding how, say, historical denial, when paired with mythologization, can create a completely fabricated reality.
Making it hard to argue against with just facts.
Precisely, because it often bypasses logic entirely. It appeals to emotion, to identity.
Okay, so what are these 7 methods?
Let's break them down. First, there's historical denial. This is the most overt form, the abject rejection of archives and historical evidence.
Like just saying something didn't happen.
Exactly.
Yeah.
A stark, globally recognized example is Holocaust denial, where irrefutable evidence survivor testimonies, meticulously documented Nazi records, forensic proof, is simply dismissed as a hoax.
Right, undeniable stuff.
Or another clear instance, often promoted by figures like Dinesh D'Souza and amplified on platforms like 4chan's poll message board, is the claim that Hitler was a socialist.
Oh, I've heard that one.
Yeah, and it completely ignores the historical realities of Nazism, which, violently suppressed actual socialist and communist movements and was economically focused on strengthening the state for war, not redistributing wealth in a socialist manner. It's a deliberate distortion to confuse and misinform.
Okay, so that's denial. What's next?
Second, we often see a belief in cyclical or teleological history. Now, teleological might sound a bit academic.
Yeah, break that down.
It simply means assuming a predetermined path or ultimate purpose for where we've been or where we're going. Traditionalists, for instance, frequently view the current world as a low point in a grand preordained cycle, necessitating a redemption or a restart to return to a perceived golden age.
Like history repeats itself, but in a very specific, guided way.
Kind of, but with a definite endpoint or a necessary return. This isn't a new idea. Figures like Francesco Petrarca, the 14th century Italian poet, believed he lived in a dark age, despite being at the cusp of the Renaissance. For many on the far right today, heavily influenced by thinkers like the Italian esoteric philosopher Julius Evola, they often see themselves as elite figures riding the tiger of modernity, mastering its chaos.
Okay.
And some even advocate for accelerationism, which is this really quite violent idea of hastening what they see as an inevitable societal collapse or even a race war. Yeah, a belief system that has tragically led to real-world attacks, like those in Christchurch, New Zealand, and El Paso, Texas. It posits that things must get worse before a rebirth can occur. It's a deeply pessimistic, yet strangely action-oriented view of history.
Okay, that's number 2. What's third?
The third method is declination narratives. This posits a theory of widespread degeneracy that replaces a nuanced understanding of historical change.
Degeneracy.
Yeah, it's the pervasive idea that modern society has fallen from some past ideal, a perceived peak of morality, order, or strength. This ideal past is often vaguely defined, but always presented as superior.
But the good old days.
Yeah.
That maybe weren't so good.
Exactly. It feeds into a profound sense of loss and a fervent desire to return to that perceived golden age, which of course never existed in the idealized form presented. It's all about decline from a fictional peak.
Got it. Number 4.
Fourth, there's mythologization. This is where facts are simply replaced with chimeras, meaning imagined or invented details.
So making things up to fit the story.
Pretty much. A powerful example cited in the source is the iconic beard of El Cid.
El Cid, the Spanish hero.
Right. While El Cid was indeed a real military leader in medieval Spain, a figure of great importance, the detail of his beard as a symbol of his honor and power, often described as so long it could be tied around his arm.
I think I've heard that.
Right. It only emerged after the fact in an epic poem written about him centuries later, the Cantar de Mio Cid. It wasn't from contemporary historical records. Yet these invented details become deeply ingrained in public memory, replacing the more complex and less heroic historical reality with a simplified, potent myth.
Fascinating. Okay, number 5.
Fifth is nostalgia for an imagined past. This often combines those declination narratives we just talked about with a highly selective remembering or underlining of historical facts while conveniently excluding others.
Like cherry-picking the good bits and ignoring the bad.
Precisely. Donald Trump's "Make America Great Again" slogan is a prime example cited in the source. It recalls an unspecified, idealized past that, when you really scrutinize it, never truly existed in the monolithic, untroubled way it's presented.
Right. Great for whom, exactly?
That's the question it avoids. The source points out this is a fascistic palingenetic tendency. Now, palingenetic means rebirth or regeneration.
Okay.
So it's essentially a myth of natural rebirth that requires a romanticized, often completely fabricated past to inspire radical transformation of the present. It's about creating a powerful emotional pull towards a fictional golden age.
Makes sense. Number 6.
Sixth, we have ahistoricism. This is perhaps the simplest and most direct method. Arguments based purely on untruth without any grounding in historical evidence whatsoever.
Just lies.
Basically, yes. It's a blatant disregard for factual accuracy built entirely on fiction, often presented as a self-evident truth that, they don't want you to know. It's history as pure invention.
Okay. And the last one, number 7.
And finally, the seventh method involved the fragmented and biased nature of public memory. History isn't just confined to academic textbooks or dusty archives, right?
No, it's everywhere. Movies, TV.
Exactly. It's profoundly shaped by films, television shows, museums, documentaries, podcasts like ours, oral traditions, and even, critically in the modern age, internet message boards like 4chan.
Yeah, the internet's huge for this.
Absolutely. These popular cultural forms can selectively remember, distort, or outright invent historical narratives, allowing alt-histories to colonize public understanding and replace genuine historical inquiry with appealing but false emotional narratives. They bypass the intellect and go straight for the gut feeling.
It's clear that these methods aren't isolated. They weave together to create these powerful, distorted tapestries. It's almost overwhelming to hear how many examples exist and the, sheer audacity of some of these fabrications.
It really is.
What really strikes me is not just that history is twisted, but how similar these insidious methods are, whether we're looking at France or Brazil or elsewhere. And these aren't just academic arguments, are they?
Not at all.
These narratives become incredibly personal, especially when they target specific groups or identities. Let's delve into how they specifically distort national narratives, women's history, and religious narratives based on the case studies in the source. Okay. Our first stop takes us to France, where we encounter Génération Identitaire, a prominent ethno-nationalist youth group. Their 2013 YouTube video became quite a viral moment.
Right, I remember that. Very stark.
It featured young, white individuals completing each other's sentences, all presented in stark black and white. Beyond their explicit statements, what do you think was the underlying message embedded in that stark imagery and those synchronized declarations? What psychological impact were they trying to achieve?
Well, the visual presentation, the black and white, the synchronized speech, it was all incredibly deliberate. It conveyed a sense of timelessness, purity almost, and collective identity, a unified, almost monolithic group speaking with one voice as if from the very dawn of time or something.
Right, very unified, very pure looking.
And their declaration itself was a direct and forceful rejection of established historical narratives and global interconnectedness. They explicitly stated, and I'm quoting here, "We've rejected your history books to regather our memories. We've started believing in a global village and the family of man. We discovered we have roots, ancestry, and therefore a future. Our heritage is our land, our blood, our identity. We are the heirs to our own future. The lambda emblem painted on our proud Spartan shields is our symbol."
Wow, rejected your history books. That's pretty direct.
Extremely direct. This statement perfectly encapsulates their rejection of the globalized world, and specifically the Cultural Revolution of the 1960s, which, it's important to remember, was a pivotal moment for anti-colonial struggles and for civil rights for people of color, women, and queer people across Europe, the U.S., and former colonies.
So they're directly attacking that legacy of progress.
Absolutely. That expansion of human rights is precisely what they seem to be rejecting in favor of this narrow blood and soil identity.
Here's where it gets really interesting, though. What they claim to have discovered about Sparta seems to be a complete historical fiction, almost a fantasy built for their agenda.
Oh, completely.
What were the specific historical inaccuracies they overlooked or deliberately twisted to fit their ethno-nationalist narrative?
Well, they overlooked or outright ignored critical historical facts about ancient Sparta. For one, Sparta was never a unifying pro-Hellenic force as they suggest. Spartan history is far more complex, often characterized by its own conflicts with other Greek city-states, not some grand unification project.
Okay, so not the united front they imply.
Not at all. And moreover, and this is truly ironic, given Generation Identitaire's conservative stance on gender and sexuality, ancient Sparta had its own very queer history that would certainly clash profoundly with the group's idealized, imagined ancient past.
Queer history in Sparta.
Really?
Yeah.
We have evidence of complex homoerotic bonds, particularly within Spartan military training, which was an accepted part of their societal structure. It wasn't hidden.
Huh. That definitely doesn't fit their narrative.
Not in the slightest. This complete disregard for inconvenient facts, combined with the invention of convenient ones, demonstrates a potent combination of mythologization and ahistoricism at play. Historical reality is completely sacrificed for the sake of constructing an identity that serves their contemporary ethno-nationalist agenda. They want a simple, clean, pure past, so they basically invent one.
Fascinating how a group can cherry-pick and invent history to suit their needs, even when it means ignoring major parts of the actual record. Let's move to Spain now, where we see another powerful narrative at play. The Black Legend.
Ah, yes. La leyenda negra.
Right. This concept refers to often negative characterizations of Spain, particularly regarding its colonization of the Americas, frequently highlighting atrocities committed against indigenous populations. How are modern revisionist efforts attempting to rewrite this national narrative to reframe Spain's history?
Well, modern revisionist efforts, particularly from certain powerful right-wing circles in Spain, are working hard to reframe the narrative by portraying Spain as the main victim of these historical events.
Spain as the victim, how does that work?
It's a rhetorical maneuver, right? Highly effective in shifting attention away from the undeniable atrocities committed against indigenous peoples in the Americas, things like forced labor, mass killings, cultural destruction.
So deflection.
Exactly. They put forth arguments like, and I'm quoting the source's summary here, "It is wrong and unfair to denounce 3 centuries of colonization for what happened during the first half-century, and that if mistakes and crimes had been committed, they were attributable to men who acted without any control, but never to the conquering country, and even less to the monarchy."
Blame the individuals, not the system or the crown.
Precisely. It's a clear attempt to absolve the Spanish crown and the nation from responsibility for colonial violence by individualizing the blame, thereby sanitizing a difficult historical period. The Spanish Falange Party, for example, especially after the traumatic loss of its remaining colonies in 1898, aggressively pushed a mythical vision of Hispanidad to recast the entire Spanish colonial period as benign and glorious, basically creating a nationalist narrative of a perfect, unblemished past as a balm for national humiliation.
This raises an important question then. How does a figure like El Cid, a historical military leader, become reimagined as a patriotic, democratic figure, especially when they're tied to an authoritarian regime like Franco's dictatorship. It feels like a massive leap to bridge that gap.
It's a masterful, deliberate act of historical engineering, really. Under Franco's dictatorship, which, let's remember, came to power through a brutal civil war.
Right.
The military leader El Cid was reimagined and aggressively promoted to legitimate Franco's authoritarian rule, particularly to democratic Europe, which was, understandably, wary of his regime.
So Cid was PR for Franco.
In a way, yes. El Cid, as a military leader who gained power, was presented as someone who, much like Franco himself supposedly, rose to prominence amongst an elite to save Spain. This framing made him, and by extension Franco, appear patriotic and somehow democratic, rather than an authoritarian who violently overthrew a democratic republic and was responsible for hundreds of thousands of deaths.
Wow.
And this reimagining even gained global traction with Hollywood's 1961 film El Cid, starring Charlton Heston.
Oh, I know that movie. Big epic.
Huge epic. And crucially, that film received significant financial support from the Franco regime itself. This cinematic portrayal helped solidify and globalize this distorted narrative, making El Cid an international symbol of Spanishness based on a false and politically motivated premise.
And do these distortions still have an impact today?
Oh, absolutely. The effects aren't confined to old films. They are chillingly real and resonate in the present. To this day, ethno-nationalist groups like Skinheads Burgos hold yearly ceremonies at El Cid's statue in Burgos, a historical Falange stronghold, by the way, to celebrate the expulsion of Muslims and Jews from Spain, using the mythologized El Cid as their icon.
So the myth lives on in extremist circles.
And unfortunately, it's popularly believed by many Spaniards too, showing the deep impact of this historical manipulation. Furthermore, the historical concept of convivencia, the nuanced and complex reality of Jews, Christians, and Muslims often living in close proximity and with significant cultural exchange in medieval Iberia, is also actively distorted.
How so?
Well, scholars like Dario Fernandez Morera, for example, are cited as cherry-picking evidence, relying on outdated scholarship, and deliberately misrepresenting opponents to promote an explicitly extreme right-wing and conservative Christian political agenda. His work basically replaces a nuanced view of medieval Spanish society with a dystopian one, pushing a narrative of inherent conflict.
And there's an agenda behind that kind of scholarship.
It seems so. It's noteworthy that his publisher, ISI Books, is identified as a conservative think tank actively promoting traditional values and Judeo-Christian frameworks, illustrating the ideological backing for such revisionism.
So we've seen how alt-histories rewrite national narratives. Let's shift now to how they target even more fundamental aspects of identity, specifically women's history and religious narratives. How is Joan of Arc, for instance, used and, well, abused in France by far-right groups?
Joan of Arc, yeah, the iconic French heroine and saint, she has been blatantly appropriated and abused by the French National Rally, formerly known as the Front National.
How did they use her?
They use her image to fit their anti-immigrant and conservative stance, completely stripping her of historical complexity and constructing a narrative that serves their modern political agenda. For them, she becomes a symbol of pure, unadulterated Frenchness that implicitly excludes immigrants, rather than reflecting her actual historical context as, a peasant girl who rallied a fractured nation during a specific conflict.
So another case of simplifying and mythologizing for political gain.
Exactly. It's a classic case of selective historical framing to create a powerful but ultimately false national myth.
And what about within the Christian right in the United States? How are biblical figures being reinterpreted to push specific agendas, particularly those that might undermine women or promote a certain racial ideology?
Well, within certain segments of the Christian identity movement, which is, it's important to state, a white supremacist interpretation of Christianity.
Okay, important context.
Biblical figures like Eve and Mary Magdalene are radically reinterpreted. Eve, traditionally the mother of mankind, is recast not just with the original sin, but as having created white men's supposed greatest enemy, Judaism.
Wow, that's incredibly anti-Semitic.
Deeply so. A complete twisting of Scripture. And Mary Magdalene, often historically linked with the whore narrative and certain traditional, though often debated interpretations, is used further to undermine feminine power, framing women as inherently sinful and secondary.
How do they justify that?
Biblical passages are cherry-picked and amplified to support these misogynistic and oppressive interpretations. For example, Colossians 3:18, "Wives, submit yourselves unto your own husbands, as it is fit in the Lord." Or passages from Revelation, like 17.56, which speaks of the mother of harlots and abominations of the earth, are taken out of context and used to emphasize women as inherently sinful and subordinate.
Just grabbing verses that fit the narrative.
Pretty much. And a particularly egregious example is the Ku Klux Klan's manipulation of Alma Bridwell White.
Who was she?
She became the first female bishop in the United States in 1918. Quite a figure.
Okay. How does the KKK use her?
They attempt to laud her as the first feminist in America because she advocated for women's suffrage. However, and this is the crucial distortion, this advocacy was strictly limited to white Protestant women, and it was coupled with her overt racism and extreme intolerance.
Ah, so they conveniently leave that part out.
Completely. White herself famously stated, and this is a direct quote cited, "It is within the rights of civilization for the white race to hold the supremacy, and it is no injustice to the colored man."
Unbelievable.
So this selective and decontextualized historical framing gives a false legitimacy to their deeply prejudiced ideology, twisting a figure of female accomplishment into a symbol that endorses their white supremacist views. It's a chilling example of how even progressive achievements can be co-opted and distorted.
These examples truly show how deeply personal identities and beliefs can be intertwined with manipulated history. Let's bring the discussion to more recent, globally resonant examples of how imagined pasts fuel contemporary conflict, starting with the chilling events of the Unite the Right rally in Charlottesville, Virginia.
Right, Charlottesville 2017, that was a stark visual manifestation of alt-history in action. White nationalists marched anachronistically armed with clubs, swords, and shields carrying medieval-inspired heraldry.
Like something out of a fantasy movie, almost?
Almost, but terrifyingly real. They displayed Crusader and Viking flags and shields adorned with ancient Roman symbols, explicitly claiming deep historical roots from medieval and ancient traditions to legitimize their white supremacist agenda. This wasn't just protest, it was a performative act of alt-history, literally embodying an imagined purified past. They wanted to project themselves as the heirs of some imagined, exclusively white European heritage.
But how accurate is that image of a purely white medieval Europe?
Not accurate at all. The historical reality, as the source points out, profoundly counters this myth. Bioarchaeological studies have unequivocally shown that medieval Europe was not exclusively populated by white Europeans.
Really?
Yes. Africans and people of color were present, often in prominent roles across Europe. For example, Saint Maurice, a Roman legionary saint, was depicted as black from at least the 13th century in various European artworks, notably in Magdeburg Cathedral.
Huh. I didn't know that.
And the Tomb of Victor, a Roman African soldier, exists in South Shields, England, dating back to Roman times. Furthermore, enslaved Africans were regularly transported to Europe from as early as the 11th century, with significant shipments like Portuguese Prince Henry the Navigator bringing 235 enslaved Africans in 1444.
So the idea of a purely white medieval past is just wrong.
It's a fabrication. This historical evidence directly contradicts the myth that the alt-right seeks to invoke. Their performance in Charlottesville was built on historical sand.
You mentioned Julius Evola earlier. How does he fit into this alt-right medievalism?
The influence of Italian philosopher Julius Evola is crucial here. He heavily impacted Mussolini's fascism and continues to resonate with contemporary alt-right ideologues. Evola's work, especially Revolt Against the Modern World, promotes knighthood not just as a historical profession, but as a spiritual identity that transcends and even replaces Christianity.
A spiritual knighthood.
Yes. For Evola, chivalry supersedes time and place, meaning its essence is eternal and can be reclaimed by modern individuals. This philosophy allows the Charlottesville demonstrators to fashion themselves as modern-day knights, drawing on this imagined trans-historical tradition.
And this connects to that palingenetic idea again.
Directly. That myth of national resurgence and regeneration that's absolutely central to fascism. Mussolini himself famously aimed to restore lost Roman virtues into a new man, embodying this same desire for a mythical rebirth rooted in a fabricated past. Evola provides a kind of pseudo-spiritual framework for it.
Okay, moving to Brazil now. Jair Bolsonaro's radical right campaign effectively mobilized voters by evoking the threat of a communist revolution associated with the Workers' Party, the PT. How did his movement manipulate the past to fuel this pervasive fear, drawing on historical anxieties?
Bolsonaro's rhetoric skillfully tapped into Brazil's deep-seated historical anxieties, particularly its traumatic past of conservative democratization after its 1964-1985 civil-military dictatorship.
Conservative democratization, what does that mean?
It means the transition to democracy was managed in a way that protected many figures from the dictatorship. It was characterized by a general and unrestricted amnesty that effectively safeguarded regime agents from prosecution, creating what many refer to as pact of forgetting.
So no real reckoning with the past.
Largely, no. Bolsonaro's campaign leveraged this by invoking the specter of left-wing internationalism, skillfully shifting the Cold War's threat from the Soviet Union to regional entities like Cuba and Venezuela. Conspiracy theories, such as those surrounding the Foro de São Paulo, a forum for Latin American left-wing parties, were heavily promoted.
By whom?
By figures like Bolsonaro's self-proclaimed intellectual guru, Olavo de Carvalho, who claimed it orchestrated a spectacular and overwhelming leftist expansion across the continent, despite offering little credible substantiation. It was essentially a classic Red Scare, updated for the 21st century, playing on old fears.
And did race play into this as well? Brazil has a complex racial history.
Absolutely. This narrative also drew on Brazil's complex and painful history of racial theories. Euclides de Cunha's seminal 1902 work, Os Sertões, Backlands, a foundational text of Brazilian literature, described miscegenation, the mixing of races, as regression.
Regression.
Yes, and it framed the Canudos campaign, a major civil conflict in the late 19th century, as a struggle in terms of the hermeneutics of sacred time and race versus secular progress and deep hierarchies. This historical framing, which imbued racial mixing with a negative, degenerative connotation, allowed for the reinvocation of deep-seated feels about racial purity and societal degeneration that resonated powerfully with the radical right's agenda, giving historical weight to their contemporary prejudices. Let's turn to Italy's post-1989 period. The source mentions a renewed interest in crimes committed by the Allies during the World War II occupation, particularly focusing on rapes by soldiers of color and interracial sexual encounters. What's fascinating here is how memories of past violence by foreign soldiers are deliberately linked to perceived threats from contemporary immigrants, threatening the very fabric of the Italian national body. How is this memory recast to serve such specific political ends? That's a powerful and disturbing example of how historical trauma can be weaponized. This sexual disorder narrative, focusing on alleged rapes and interracial sexual encounters during the Allied occupation, particularly involving soldiers of color, was strategically revived to serve multiple contemporary political purposes.
Okay, like what?
Firstly, and most overtly, it was used to criminalize contemporary male African immigrants to Italy. By drawing a direct, albeit false, line from historical incidents involving foreign soldiers, especially non-white ones, to current immigration, it fueled xenophobia against present-day migrant populations.
Using past trauma to demonize present groups?
Exactly. Secondly, it aimed to explain what they framed as the weak state of Italian national unity, suggesting that these past violations somehow compromised the nation's integrity. And crucially, it was used to claim the status of victim for various groups of Italians, thereby functioning as an escape from the deep, uncomfortable guilt for fascist crimes committed during the war.
The victimhood narrative again. Deflection.
Precisely. It's a deflection tactic, shifting blame, and creating a new victim narrative for Italy itself, rather than confronting its own role alongside Nazi Germany. The discourse explicitly links these historical sexual disorders to a perceived threat from contemporary immigrants, particularly African men, to the very Italian national body, creating a continuity of threat that is entirely constructed and deeply harmful.
Moving to the Balkans now, we've seen a consistent pattern of historical denial and conflicting narratives, even in very recent times. The source mentions incidents from 2016 to 2018.
Yes, in former Yugoslavia. They illustrate this vividly. A convicted Bosnian Croat war criminal's death was commemorated as martyrdom, despite his horrific crimes. A train painted Kosovo as Serbia led to military threats between nations. A Bosnian Serb president banned teaching about the siege of Sarajevo and the Srebrenica genocide in schools.
Banned teaching it.
Yes. And a film denied the true nature of the Jasenovac death camp, a WWII concentration camp run by the Croatian Ustaš regime. These are not just disagreements over facts. They're active campaigns of denial and rewriting.
What does this say about dealing with the past in that region?
Well, these events highlight a profound insight from the source, that historical dialogue is largely a political and emotional process, not merely a discursive one. The core problem isn't intellectual inability to understand historical facts or a lack of access to evidence.
So it's not about people not knowing the facts?
Not primarily. Instead, it's an ideologized and emotional barrier that prevents acknowledgement of uncomfortable facts. This creates a powerful, almost unbreakable dynamic where a victim cannot be the perpetrator, nor can a perpetrator be a hero.
Meaning groups can't see themselves as both victims and perpetrator.
Exactly. This psychological and political block prevents groups from acknowledging responsibility for injustices committed by their own side, trapping them in cycles of mutual grievance and denial. It's a collective refusal to confront uncomfortable truths about their own past actions.
And finally, let's look at Germany, where the Dresden bombing in 1945 has also been re-imploded by the far right to contest German war guilt. How exactly is this specific historical event being distorted and used in this revisionist agenda?
The far right re-implots the Dresden bombing to create what the source calls a doubly displaced narrative. They describe the victims as having to first flee the Eastern Front from the advancing Red Army, seeking refuge, only to be bombed once more after finding what they hoped would be safety in Dresden.
Okay, highlighting their suffering twice over.
Right. This narrative semantically subverts the traditional concept of the refugee. It cleverly generates parallels, rendering morally comparable civilians of an aggressor nation, Nazi Germany, with those displaced by Nazi aggression across Europe.
So blurring the lines between victims of the regime and victims of the Allies fighting the regime.
Precisely. Crucially, even child victims who were members of the Hitler Youth were morally inoculated in this framing. Their involvement with the regime was ignored to paint them as pure victims. This entire reframing is an attempt to recast the bombing as a singular, heinous war crime, thereby relativizing German war guilt for the immense destruction and atrocities of World War II. It's a deeply cynical attempt to shift the narrative of victimhood.
Is there pushback against this narrative?
Oh, yes. But there was even a peculiar clash noted in 2017 surrounding the Dresden bombing, where both the political left and the far right apparently misread history regarding refugee numbers during the bombing.
Oh, so?
While the left used the historical plight of Dresdeners to try and garner support for contemporary Syrian refugees, arguing for universal empathy.
Okay.
The far right, in a stark contrast, refused to extend that empathy to present-day refugees. This highlights how, as the source puts it, empathy works historically backward but fails to extend into the present within these distorted narratives.
So they use the past victimhood but won't apply the lesson to today.
Exactly. The Dresden bombing became a tool not for universal understanding, but to assert a specific, self-serving victimhood for Germans, rather than a moment for broader human empathy or genuine historical reflection. It's about leveraging a past trauma to serve a narrow, often xenophobic, present agenda.
So what does all of this mean for today? How are these complex, often distorted narratives spreading and gaining such powerful traction in the digital age? It seems like the internet has become not just a platform, but a massive force multiplier for these alt-histories, amplifying them far beyond what was previously possible.
It absolutely has. The internet and social media platforms, YouTube, 4chan, Facebook, and countless smaller niche forums, have allowed fringe radical right-wing groups that otherwise would have likely found themselves marginalized to construct virulent social networks.
Right. Connecting people who were previously isolated.
Exactly, and connecting their fascistic ideologies with unprecedented reach. These platforms provide an echo chamber effect that was simply not possible in previous eras. And critically, their algorithms often prioritize engagement.
Meaning clicks, likes, shares, anger.
Right. Content that sparks strong emotions, including anger or outrage, often gets amplified regardless of its factual basis. This creates filter bubbles, where individuals are primarily exposed to information that confirms their existing beliefs, making it harder for alternative, evidence-based narratives to break through. It's kind of self-reinforcing feedback loop.
Can you give some specific examples of these online spaces?
Sure. Delving deeper, online discussion boards like the infamous 4chan and the now defunct 8chan, which unfortunately has been linked to acts of extreme real-world violence, are prime examples of this digital amplification. Discussions there are often framed in terms of dark imaginings of the past, fostering a sense of apocalyptic decline.
Dark imaginings.
Yeah. These spaces are often described as distinctly esoteric, meaning they promise to reveal secret or stigmatized knowledge to initiates, cultivating a sense of exclusive hidden truths that the mainstream supposedly suppresses. This narrative of a hidden truth is incredibly seductive for some people.
And this has its own aesthetic, right?
It does. This digital esotericism is visually embodied in the Fashwave aesthetic, which combines occult symbols like the black sun with vaporwave, a digital art style that's often nostalgic for an imagined cyberpunk future.
Right, I've seen that aesthetic. Very distinctive.
And the vernacular shorthand for subscribing to this metapolitics, which is all about subtly shifting the wider cultural conversation and language, not just direct party politics, is taking the red pill, a phrase borrowed from the Matrix.
Of course.
This is presented as an esoteric experience of awakening from the induced somnambulism of liberal mainstream society. It's a powerful, almost religious framing of a political ideology.
And Evola comes up again here.
Heavily. This digital esotericism draws significantly on Julius Evola's overarching reactionary theory of history, which viewed Western history as a long narrative of decline, a concept he borrowed from the Hindu cycle of ages, specifically the Kali Yuga, which represents a dark age of chaos and dissolution.
With Kali.
Right. Evola sought to restore primal truth and order to traditional Western civilization, advocating for racism of the second and third degree, where race exists not only in the body, but also in the soul and in the spirit.
Spiritual racism.
That's the idea.
Yeah.
This notion of a spiritual race, rather than just a biological one, adds a layer of pseudo-intellectualism and perceived depth to their racial ideology. We also see references to esoteric Hitlerism from figures like Miguel Serrano, which blends esoteric spiritual ideas like Gnostic Manichaeism, this dualistic philosophy seeing the world as a battle between good and evil, with practices like Kundalini Yoga.
Wow, that's quite a mix.
It is, and it gives occultic guise to infuse a once moribund ideology with an aura of seemingly deep spiritual significance. It's an attempt to legitimize extreme political views with a veneer of spiritual profundity.
So these aren't just random individuals or isolated online communities. There are organized efforts like Arctos Media acting as formal publishers for this true right. Tell us about them, because a publisher implies a deliberate strategy for dissemination.
Absolutely. Arctos Media, initially founded as ITP, Integral Tradition Publishing, by Jacob Christensen Senholt and Patrick Bach, serves as a primary publisher and translator for the European New Right movement.
Okay.
They specialize in publishing short, readable texts by resurrected proto-fascist and European New Right philosophers, along with pseudo-historical and mythological works that seek to restore a lost sense of white European identity. These are carefully curated to promote a specific ideology.
And who are they publishing, besides Evola?
Well, notable authors include Evola, whom we've discussed, and Hans F. K. Gunther, who is a prominent Nazi eugenicist, which clearly demonstrates the explicit ideological lineage they're drawing from.
So they're not hiding the connections?
Not really within their own circles. Their strategy, as articulated by former editor-in-chief John Morgan, is explicitly metapolitical. He states they are trying to find alternatives to modernity, to the current liberal order, and are waging war on the cultural as well as the political level to instill a vision of the future that can inspire them.
Waging war on the cultural level.
That's the phrase used. Morgan defines the true right as principles accepted and seen as normal by every well-born person everywhere in the world prior to 1789, which means pre-French Revolution.
Pre-1789, that's quite a rollback.
It's a clear signal of their desire to reinstate classism, rigid social castes, and hierarchies, essentially rolling back centuries of Enlightenment thought and democratic progress.
How do they spread these ideas? Just publishing books?
Their dissemination tactics are quite sophisticated, actually, combining both digital and analog methods. They produce aesthetically designed, accessible volumes that look professional and appealing. They offer bulk discounts like 35% off for 5 or more titles, which incentivizes widespread purchase.
Making it cheaper to buy more.
Right. They even encourage customers to become community retailers, to sell books to friends and family, effectively creating a decentralized, grassroots word-of-mouth distribution network. This ensures their radical ideas bypass traditional gatekeepers and reach a wider audience.
And are there figures who translate these ideas for a broader online audience?
Yes. The source points to figures like the Golden One, Marcus Fallen, a Swedish far-right YouTuber. He's described as a translator of these often dense texts for a broader audience.
How does he do that?
He produces a continuous stream of videos, often shirtless and flexing muscles, where he decries cultural Marxism, globalists, multiculturalism, and beta-leftists. He mixes workout tips with his own variations of history, acting as a charismatic conduit for fascistic ideologies to millions of viewers, particularly young men who might be drawn in by the fitness content before being exposed to the political messages. He makes the inaccessible ideas of Evola seem relatable and even aspirational.
Now, Jordan Peterson is another figure who has gained immense popularity, particularly through his opposition to Canada's Bill C-16 regarding gender identity. He frequently uses the term postmodern neo-Marxism to describe what he sees as a destructive force. How does this tie into the cultural Marxism conspiracy theory, and what does it reveal about the spread and mainstreaming of these alt-history-adjacent ideas?
Peterson's postmodern neo-Marxism claim is, as the source notes, nearly indistinguishable from the cultural Marxism conspiracy theory.
Okay.
And this cultural Marxism theory itself is almost identical to the literal Nazi conspiracy theory of cultural Bolshevism. The core of this conspiracy posits that an international cabal of Marxist academics, often implicitly or explicitly Jewish, aims to destroy Western civilization by undermining its cultural values, targeting institutions like universities, media, and family structures.
So Peterson's term echoes these older anti-Semitic conspiracy theories.
The source argues the connection is very direct. Peterson's use of this term, dressed in academic language and presented with intellectual authority, directly echoes these deeply rooted tropes, giving them a new, seemingly legitimate platform. That's a classic example of an idea moving from the fringe towards the mainstream conversation.
And what about his specific claims regarding Bill C-16?
Well, Peterson's claims about Bill C-16 leading to criminalization for pronoun misuse have been widely debunked by numerous legal scholars as specious legal claims, meaning they are misleading or lack legal merit.
So legal experts disagreed strongly.
Overwhelmingly. Despite this, these unfounded fears gained significant traction in public discourse and among his vast following. This really raises an important question for all of us. How do such demonstrably false or misleading assertions from influential figures find such fertile ground and gain widespread acceptance, especially when they cater to pre-existing anxieties or prejudices?
Yeah, why do people believe it?
It speaks to a powerful willingness, perhaps, to believe narratives that confirm one's worldview, regardless of factual basis, and how easily fear can sometimes override reason in public discourse.
Okay, if we connect all of this to the bigger picture, why does this manipulation of history matter so deeply? What are the real-world consequences of these alt-histories? It seems like it's far more than just intellectual dishonesty or, some academic debate. It has tangible, often terrifying impacts.
It is far, far more than that. Alt-histories are weaponized not just in abstract arguments, but in tangible, destructive ways. They are explicitly used, as the source states, to legitimate essentialist, racist, sexist, ethnocentric, nationalist, and heteronormative beliefs.
So they provide justification for prejudice.
Exactly. By deliberately distorting the past, they don't just shift opinions. They actively move radical ideologies into the public sphere and normalize them, making once unthinkable ideas seem acceptable or at least debatable. This presents a very real risk to the study and utility of history itself, because when the very concept of shared verifiable truth is eroded, history loses its power to teach us, to hold power accountable, and frankly, to guide our collective future.
And does this link to actual violence?
Tragically, yes. The consequences are profoundly real and manifest in physical violence and hate crimes. We've seen this devastatingly in incidents like the Christchurch mosque shootings in New Zealand, the El Paso Walmart shooting targeting Hispanics, and the violence at the Charlottesville rally we discussed earlier.
All fueled by these kinds of narratives.
All fueled by ideologies deeply rooted in these fabricated histories and white supremacist narratives. The source provides a really sobering reminder that rings true across time. History only repeats itself when people no longer see themselves as historical actors. History only repeats itself when we do not learn from our mistakes, or worse, fail to recognize them.
So, forgetting or distorting the past makes us doomed to repeat it.
Essentially, yes. When people are fed a fabricated past, when they believe a lie about how things came to be, they are deprived of the crucial lessons necessary to avoid repeating its worst aspects. It disarms us from critical thinking and damages our collective memory.
Given that, what's the role of genuine historical inquiry in countering this?
It's absolutely crucial. Historians, while acknowledging that they approach history with their own present-formed questions, we all live in a now, after all, must rigorously avoid faulty logic and intentional distortion. It's about a disciplined pursuit of understanding, using evidence even if the truths unearthed are uncomfortable or challenge cherished national or personal beliefs.
And it's not just for historians, right?
Absolutely not. The interdisciplinary nature of the source material for this deep dive itself underscores a vital point. Scholars of all disciplines and non-scholars alike all have a stake in history. By bringing diverse experts from neuroscientists looking at belief formation to lawyers examining hate speech together, we can better understand ways in which history, law, and scientific knowledge have been weaponized by the far right more broadly, and thus figure out how to counter these insidious tactics. It truly is a collective responsibility.
This raises an important question, and it's perhaps the most critical one for our listeners. Given how prevalent and sophisticated these alt-histories are and how rapidly they spread in our digital landscape, how can we as individuals become more discerning consumers of history and information? Especially when these narratives appeal so strongly to emotion, it feels like a massive, daunting challenge.
It absolutely is a challenge, but not an insurmountable one. There are strategies we can employ both in our personal consumption of information and potentially in our engagement with others. One powerful mental tool suggested by the source, which can be seen as a kind of pedagogical approach, is queer asynchrony.
Queer asynchrony, what's that?
Think of it as deliberately holding up a critical mirror, contrasting those idealized, often mythical versions of the past with the fragmented, messy, and often inconvenient realities of today or other historical periods.
Okay, so comparing the myth to reality.
Exactly. When you encounter a romanticized vision of a golden age or a pure historical identity, consciously ask yourself, who was left out of that picture? What inconvenient truths or voices are being ignored? What messy details are being airbrushed out? The source gives an example of maybe teaching fictional narratives like Game of Thrones alongside academic analysis of actual medieval history, or even analyzing Chaucer's Man of Law's tale alongside the historical record of something like the George Hughes lynching, to expose sham chivalries and dismantle dangerous myths like Southern chivalry that have justified centuries of violence and oppression. It's about recognizing the deliberate gaps and omissions in the stories we're told.
That's a powerful critical thinking tool. What about engaging with people who already hold these distorted views? That seems incredibly difficult.
It is incredibly difficult and often frustrating. But the source suggests communication strategies borrowed from unexpected places might be surprisingly useful, though obviously used with care and judgment. From improv comedy, there's the yes and maxim.
Yes and.
Yeah. It means finding a point of commonality or agreement first, however small, then building tangentially from there to introduce new information or different perspective. For instance, you might say, yes, I agree it's important to understand our history, and what's interesting is that new archaeological evidence suggests it avoids immediate confrontation.
Okay, find common ground first.
Or, perhaps more strategically, from hostage negotiations, there's the idea that people in a defensive position often find it easier to say yes after they've already said no.
Get a no first. How does that work?
You could potentially get the other party to say no first by posing a question you know they will disagree with, which might make them paradoxically more receptive to your actual points later on. For example, maybe asking something like, you don't think considering X historical evidence is really necessary here, do you? Once they say no, defending the idea of considering evidence perhaps, they might be slightly more open to hearing why certain evidence is important.
Huh. Interesting psychological tactic.
It's definitely advanced and context dependent. These aren't magic bullets, of course, but they can sometimes open doors for dialogue, where a direct factual assault might just shut them down.
Right. It's about finding ways in.
Ultimately, though, we must continually reflect on Melvin Kranzberg's first law of technology. Technology is neither good nor bad, nor is it neutral. The internet, this incredibly powerful tool, is not inherently malicious, but its outcome, whether it leads to greater truth or greater distortion, depends entirely on the interactions between sociocultural situations and the values of societal institutions.
So it's up to us how it's used.
Exactly. It is up to us, as historical actors in the present, to determine how this technology is used, whether for the dissemination of genuine knowledge and critical inquiry, or for the amplification of distortion and division. We are not passive recipients. We are active participants in shaping the information landscape, whether we realize it or not. Hashtag tag outro.
Wow. What an incredible and frankly sobering deep dive this has been. We've explored the deliberate construction of alt-histories by the far right, dissecting their insidious methods, examining their global manifestations across Europe, the Americas, and elsewhere, and critically understanding their dangerous amplification in our digital age. It's abundantly clear that this isn't just about different interpretations of the past, it's about a foundational assault on shared reality itself.
Exactly. And understanding these distortions is not just an academic exercise or, a niche interest for historians, it's a critical civic responsibility that falls on all of us.
Yeah.
We must cultivate our critical thinking skills relentlessly, question the narratives we encounter, especially those that feel too simple, too perfect, or too neatly tailored to a specific ideology, and always seek out multiple credible sources. Our capacity for genuine understanding hinges on this vigilance.
So, in a world awash with information where narratives are constantly competing for our attention and belief, the true end of history isn't a final political system, perhaps?
Perhaps not.
It's the erosion of shared facts and historical truth itself, creating a fractured reality where constructive dialogue becomes almost impossible.
A chilling thought.
What responsibility do we each bear, then, in preserving not just the past, but the very integrity of how we understand it and how we build our shared future upon that understanding? It's a profound question for all of us, I think, to consider long after this conversation ends.
Indeed it is.
Thank you for joining us on this deep dive into the complex, vital history all around us.